The first impression that comes to our mind about any college: tall buildings, big classrooms, large lobby areas, thick books, IT labs, assignments, class tests, and projects. Nothing besides that. Every hour, minute, second spent here help us carving and shaping our persona, cultivating innovative mindsets for the challenging world. Learning is a lifelong process. Sharing knowledge, inculcating values of life, spark the innovative horizons of mind. Fun and frolic is the nature of every nook and corner here. A daily dose of thrill we are sure to get here.
Good evening, everyone. I am Manmeet Kaur, Assistant Professor, DME Media School. Welcome you all to the BG Verghese Lecture Series organized by Media School at Delhi Metropolitan Education, Noida. DME is a premier education institution affiliated to Guru Gobind Singh Indraprasth University, offering courses in BA LLB, BBA LLB, BBA, and Bachelors of Journalism and Mass Communication. BG Verghese lecture series are organized in the memory of Mr. Bubli George Verghese, a senior journalist and a winner of prestigious Raman Maksase Award for outstanding contribution in journalism. Media School has taken this initiative to create much needed industry-academia interface and provide students with the opportunities to interact with the stalwarts from the media industry. These lectures also abreast the students with the latest trends and developments in the media fraternity. So today, the expert of the day is Dr. Otis from University of Maryland, Washington, DC, United States. Before I call the expert of the day to enlighten us about the early days of journalism in India, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Amrish Saxena, Dean DME Media School and Director Studios and Production at DME and Director International Relations at DME to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, Manmeet. So when we talk about history of journalism, obviously it's very rich. Starting from Hickey's Gazette in 1780 till this date, and even if we talk about whatever happened till the time of independence in 1947, lots of things happened, but definitely Hickey is in the foundation of Indian journalism. When we talk about modern journalism, obviously there are references in Indian history of journalism wherein something was happening in the Mughal period or in other monarchy here and there, but then they were not the newspapers in the real sense. So the real newspaper, the way we look at a newspaper in the present day context, wherein the reporting is being done, where the editing is being done, wherein a newspaper, a final product is coming out and it's being circulated. So all those features happened in Hickey's Gazette only. Later on, for another 20 to 30 years, many more newspapers happened till the time of 1818, when this Raja Ram Mohan Roy emerged on the scene, and the newspapers had a turn around, and content-wise, the newspapers changed, the impact-wise, the newspapers changed, and then rest is the history. So many developments happened in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and the journalism started taking shape. Practically, the present-day journalism started taking shape in 20th century, in the second and the third and the fourth decade. But then, for about 150 years almost, we find that journalism was having a steady growth in India, right from English journalism to language journalism, right from the Indians who were involved, right from the Britishers who were involved, or the other Europeans who were involved in taking out newspapers, and then more and more Indians got involved. So all this is a history. And when we look at the journalism history, obviously, why we look at the journalism history, or why we should should look at journalism history. That's the basic point. So I believe as a media teacher that if we go back to the history and try to find the roots of journalism, that gives an insight about the present day journalism, whether we talk about the anti-establishment journalism, whether we talk about the investigative journalism. So all these things we study a lot in today's time, but the roots are somewhere in the history. And as I look at, I mean, there's Andrew Otis has done his research on this, obviously, so we have invited him to speak on this issue. But as I have understood, Hicky did some very remarkable thing, and particularly he laid the foundation of a journalism which is fearless, wherein journalists are fearless. They don't hesitate in writing against the government in power, which is, in any case, even in today's time, if we look at journalism, we find that we need that kind of journalism. In Indian context, in the present day context also, we find that we need that kind of journalism wherein the journalists, the newspapers, they dare to write about the wrongdoings of the government. So even today, we find that it's happening day by day, difficult in India, but Hickey did it 170, 180 years ago. So that's the importance of Hickey. So in today's session, obviously, we will get to know more and more about Hickey and Hickey's Gazette and Hickey's journalism, because the person who has an authority on the subject is with us. So I'm looking forward to this session, and I welcome Mr. Andrew Otis to accept our invitation and to join us in this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for briefing us and enlightening us for today's topic. So it is my immense pleasure to introduce all with our today's guest of BG Verghese lecture series, Dr. Andrew Otis. Dr. Andrew received his PhD from the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism in December 2021. He is an author and researcher passionate about credibility of news and journalism history. He had done pioneer work in India's journalism history and authored a book titled Hickey's Bengal Gazette, the untold story of India's first newspaper. And he was also a Fulbright Fellow, where he lived in Calcutta in 2013 and 2014, respectively. He will be speaking on Hickey's Gazette and the foundation of journalism in India. So thank you, sir, for joining us today. And we are eagerly waiting to listen from our expert of the session. Over to you, sir.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the invites and the introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, you should all be able to see that. Wonderful. So I'm here to present what I think is one of the most remarkable newspapers of the 18th century, Hickey's Bengal Gazette. And you're very fortunate because it happened in your own country in India. And so I think today we'll kind of dig into this legacy and dig into a bit of your own history, which I hope you'll find fascinating and at least enlightening for the time I'm here. Okay, so this newspaper was printed and named after its founder, a man named James Augustus Hickey, and it was printed for only 2 short years, from 1780 to 1782, when the British were beginning to conquer India. So I'm also the author of a book on the topic, and we'll talk about that later. So discovering the beginnings of India's journalism history, it's a journey that took me from the United States, here's the Morgan Library in the US, to India, Victoria Memorial, Calcutta, spent many months there. Beautiful archives in Germany, many in England, the British Library here, and back to India. In total, about 5 years of research and writing to sort of discover the history of what happened to India's first newspaper, including very many local sweaty train rides in Calcutta. To anyone from the city, you have my condolences for your crowded trains. Okay, and many archives around the country. Here's the back room from Madras University archive. I was invited by a professor of the university, and what I want you to focus on is not these stacks of books. One second. it's actually what I want you to focus on. These are newspapers, bound volumes of newspapers from the 18th and 19th century, and they're in poor condition. So many of the archives that I worked in to discover the story were very much, this is an extreme example, but we're sort of along this line. Is everyone hearing me all right? Yeah, okay, good. And also the opportunity to visit many local records in smaller district towns. Here's Tentulia, West Bengal. All right, so the first thing before I move on and before I really discuss this topic is a misperception I want to correct. And that is there is no surviving image of the founder of India's first newspaper. The closest thing we have is a signature here. All right, so Hickey's Bengal Gazette was founded in 1780 in Calcutta. And this was the capital of British Bengal. It's quickly becoming one of the most important cities for trade, international trade in Asia. And it was the center of the British Empire. Specifically, Hickey's Gazette was founded in Radha Bazaar, which is in the center of the city. All right, so these are the very first pages of India's very first newspaper. This would have revolutionized the way information in India is spread, is transmitted. So consider everything previously had to be handwritten, and now it's printed. All right. So what do you notice? Well, first thing, you might notice there are no images. There's no illustrations, no photographs of any type. Technology for that comes much later. Remember, this is 1780, and photography is around 1850, 1860. Second, you'll notice generally no advertisements on the front page. And this may come as a surprise if you read the Times of India every day. You'll also notice there are a few headlines. News then was much more like letters to the editor with news and opinion all mixed in together. All right, so the first thing here, you'll notice the title of the newspaper is actually Hickey's Bengal Gazette or the Calcutta General Advertiser. So it's a gazette of information. It's also a place where things can be advertised. You also might notice something unusual with the letter F. For instance, in the word advertiser. This is actually not an F, it's an S. It's called a labial S. It's an old form of the letter. You can tell it because it has a nub only on one side. It's called the long S, and it's fallen out of fashion since the 18th century. So whenever you see an F, it's often an S. So just keep that in mind as we go along. Here's an example of an article from the front pages of the newspaper. It's about war in America, and it comes by a letter via Aleppo in Syria. So think news has to travel halfway across the world, and this takes many months, often years, to go from one continent to another. Here's more local news to India. This is about a storm off the coast, sunk some ships. So the newspaper is reporting about the storm. Here are the third and fourth pages of the Gazette. And you might notice there's more commentary here. There's some practical information, such as this notification of ships that are coming and going from the port of Calcutta. There's also advertisements more on the third and fourth pages, such as this one from the owner of a library in Calcutta. And he's wanting to sell some exceedingly good claret, which is a type of wine. So he's a librarian, but he also sells wine on the side. It's not a bad job. I would do it. There's even some poetry, such as this poem on joy and happiness. So Hickey, when writing this newspaper, he had a staff of assistants, and the newspaper was printed once a week, and it cost 1 rupee. And that's the same, to give you perspective, that's roughly the same with about 3 kilograms of rice. So it's expensive, but it's not for sort of an upper class or middle upper class person. It's within reason. The newspaper was 4 pages, and it was about 22 by 36 centimeters. And circulation was around 400 copies or so. This may seem quite low to you, but do consider that newspapers were maybe your grandparents who would read newspapers together. In the past, newspapers were often read in coffee houses, and so many people would read the newspaper together as a social activity. Hickey was an Irishman, and for the first 40 years in India, all newspapers were run and founded by Europeans. And we can talk about the transition from European run to Indian and specifically Bengali run newspapers later on. So let's talk a little bit about the founder of India's first newspaper, how he came to India, and how this random Irishman arrived in the subcontinent. So when Hickey was young, he had been orphaned and he had been apprenticed to a printer, but he also did a number of different jobs when he was growing up, including, you might find this surprising, he worked as a surgeon. He even worked in the shipping industry and the slave trade between America and Africa. Looking for a new career in 1772, he followed this path to India. It's a journey that would have taken 9 months. And upon landing in Calcutta, he started a business. However, the business failed when a ship was damaged in a storm. And by 1776, he was in jail for debt. You don't need me to tell you that debtor's prison, jail for people who can't pay their debts, is not a very pleasant place to be, or especially wasn't. Debtors had to pay for their own food, they had to pay for their own water, their own rent in jail, or else they starved. So Hickey arrives in India, he founds a business fails, and now he's in jail for debt. And he needs a way to make money again. So he uses money that he sent to a friend, and he makes types, he hires carpenters, he basically smuggles a printing press inside of the jail cell. And by 1777, he had founded Calcutta's first printing press, all while in jail. Not the first printing press in Bengal, but the first in the city itself. And this is an example of actually what might be one of the first surviving documents from North India. It's an advertisement for goods from China. This is an example of some early printing in India. And I only found this because it existed stitched in the binding of another record. So let's talk about the newspaper, get into some details about what actually happened with this and why we really should care and what's important. All right, so while much writing in Hickey's Gazette was probably by men, I do want to highlight a few exceptions. First here is an article by an Anglo-Indian woman named Old Nell. And it's 3 columns above the fold of the newspaper. So for those, I'll go back for a slide. For those who are not familiar with this, I'm sure all the budding journalists in here, 3 columns is the most important, the full width of the newspaper, and above the fold is the most important section of the paper. So Hickey, in its very first newspaper, is giving a woman what is essentially the most important part of the newspaper to express her views. This is like an opinion piece that she writes. And she says, she explains that she's an Anglo-Indian and a greengrocer, which means she sells vegetables. And she is the daughter of an Irish man and an Indian woman. And she says, though my skin is not as white as your fine ladies, it is as plump and as sleek as the best of them. She talks a bit about her life. Here she says, Mr. Hickey, my husband is a gardener. I'm therefore up at daybreak, plucking my roots and washing them for market. From whence I return, generally by 9, but sometimes sooner. I eat a hearty breakfast, not of slip-slop tea, but of good congee. After which I attend to the domestic affairs of our little cottage, while my husband is plowing and working the grounds. Our dinner is generally made from wholesome curries or poultries from the yard. Congee again serves us for supper. And thus we enjoy sound and perfect health, she writes. So this is one article that I show you out of very many, and I picked this one particularly because it shows a sort of a unique perspective on history that you don't often get. Maybe in your history classes, you've talked about Mughal lords or the emperors in the past and the sort of the big men of history. So I wanted to sort of show you a really small snippet of of someone who's more average, more lower class, talking about their life. And I can tell you a bit more about why this article was printed. It might seem unusual, why it's this 3-column above the fold talking about a woman, her life, talking about her life, in the fields working. It actually had to do with a more controversial issue involving men as midwives. And so ultimately, many things in life boil down to politics, and this is not an exception. So she explains her life, and then she goes on to discuss why she opposes men becoming midwives, delivering babies. So let me show you another article, give you a sense of what the newspaper is talking about. What are the important topics? This is about a fire in Calcutta. Fire was a major problem in the city, and especially up until around 200 years ago, cities would routinely have sections burned down due to fire. This one says, to the benevolent and powerful, be it known that 15,000, it's a bit hard to read, but 15,000 inhabitants of Calcutta are since the late fires in extreme distress. The infants wailing in their mothers' bosoms increase the calamity beyond the power of language to describe. Think upon the scene, ye patrons of the unfortunate, exert your influence, clothe their nakedness, and give them habitations. So this is another way that the newspaper would use its mouthpiece. And you may have your professors talk about speaking truth to power, about bringing to light issues that would not otherwise be. And so this is a newspaper performing that function. And it happened all the way back 220 years ago. So I'll talk a bit about why we think Hickey's Gazette is interesting, and why I came across the topic. I didn't want to just, it's not just any other newspaper. And I think we have something really special here that requires, I thought, good research. All right. So in the newspaper, Hickey accuses, here's your Governor General of India, Warren Hastings, and his wife, Marion Hastings. He accuses them of corruption. And specifically, he makes an accusation in his newspaper that his Hastings aide, one of Hastings' aides here, has solicited a bribe to protect, so to speak, the newspaper. And Hickey writes, what man can be safe where such schemes are practiced? So basically, where there's corruption rife, how can an individual be safe with their property? How can an individual be safe with their rights? In response for this accusation in the newspaper, Hastings forbids Hickey from mailing the newspaper at all, and in fact, authorizes the search and seizure of anyone's mail suspected of containing the newspaper. In some, Hickey's Bengal Gazette was found to have disturbed the peace of the settlement and was no longer permitted to be circulated. This is where the story gets interesting. This is where politics come in, and we really learn about what life was like for those trying to assert some amount of fundamental rights in India. So Hickey began sporting a slogan, and it's called a weekly commercial paper, open to all parties, but influenced by none. This becomes a slogan of the newspaper, and at first glance, it really doesn't seem like much, right? Read it back to yourself. A weekly commercial, political and commercial party, open to all parties, but influenced by none. So I'll tell you a little story. Only weeks before I finished my research and published my book, I was in a museum in Washington, D.C., actually just down the street from where I live. It's called the Newseum. It's unfortunately closed since then, but I was visiting the museum, and they have drawers and drawers of old newspapers. I just happened to pull one out of the drawer. And it's from the Massachusetts Spy. It's an old American newspaper. And look, I saw the same slogan, and I thought, oh, okay, this is interesting. 2 newspapers with the same slogan. Someone is obviously plagiarizing from someone else. It says open to all parties, influenced by none. And then I kept pulling out these drawers of newspapers, and I actually kept seeing the same slogan in many American newspapers. And these were written by pro-American independence newspapers. So keep in mind, this is the same time that the American Revolution is going on as Warren Hastings is ruling India. So these newspapers in the 13 colonies in America are arguing for independence against Britain. And they're using the slogan saying open to all parties, but influenced by none, to basically say that they're not going to be influenced by British government. And so for anyone familiar with American politics, that's quite remarkable. And I thought this was really, really cool and interesting. And until I looked at the date, actually, and you'll notice that in India, Hicky appears to have copied 1771, 1781. He copies this slogan from the American newspapers. So if you were a British, an upper class, you're an administrator of the East India Company, and you are ruling British India, and you see a newspaper support this slogan, that's a sign that things are going to get nasty pretty fast. And what I mean by that is, if you have a newspaper supporting an American pro-independence slogan in a place where the British rule, there's obviously a clash of ideologies going on, and that this is going to be in the foundation of what happens between early newspapers in India and some of the British rulers in the East India Company. So Hicky begins publishing other articles, and this one is addressed to the, quote, inhabitants of Bengal, countrymen and friends. It's a bit ambiguous, does he mean Europeans or Indians as well? Who exactly is he talking to in this article? And I think that ambiguity is intentional. I can get into that in just a bit more. But what's important about this article, and I think what a lot of people don't realize, is sort of the last section here. Hicky writes, or his reporter writes, government shall consult the welfare of the people, and that people shall obey government on that condition. And when that condition is neglected or violated, people are no longer bound to obey. So what is Hicky saying here? He's saying essentially that if there is no fundamental rights for people, then they do not have to obey their government, right? And this is a revolutionary thing to say, and obviously something that the East India Company leadership would not have taken lightly. There's one more article I want to show you before moving on. This is one criticizing a treaty that Warren Hastings had made with Maratha leader Nagpur, actually. Hicky calls Hastings wild, pusillanimous, disgraceful, and despotic, and so forth. But the most important part of this article is actually more of a personal attack against Warren Hastings. And I talk about this in my book a little bit. Hicky writes, it is reported that the great Mughal here, meaning Warren Hastings, is seized with a fit of despondency and political despair. And the faculty, meaning doctors, are of opinion his perennial spring is out of order, which is sort of the 18th century way of basically challenging someone's manhood, saying he can't get an erection. And I don't think Hicky means this literally, but this is a way to say that, excuse my English, Warren Hastings doesn't have balls to run this East India Company. We should get rid of him. And of course, you write this type of personal challenge to someone. Now, I think even in today's society, you'd be lucky to get away with it. All right. So what happens is Warren Hastings sues Hicky for libel. And as you can imagine, this did not go well. Hicky was found guilty after a dramatic trial. But one of the things, Hicky was found guilty after a dramatic trial. And one of the things I want to note here is that regardless of what Hicky wrote, the trial was sort of preordained in the sense that Warren Hastings had actually bribed a few of the judges of the Supreme Court. Here's Chief Justice Elijah Impey. Hicky had made Justice Elijah Impey the Chief Justice of a secondary court system, gave him a secondary salary, and other perks worth a few lakh rupee. Hastings also bribed a second judge, this guy is Robert Chambers, sorry. And these bribes again totaled to maybe 5 lakh rupee. How do I know this? Well, there was a third member of the court. And when I was doing research, this turned out to be really useful. This member of the court was John Hyde. He was actually an honest judge. And Hyde kept notebooks written in secret code, recording fellow judges accepting bribes. So when I was in Calcutta, I came across these notebooks and I found this code and I realized that no one had broken it before. And I thought it might be important. So I sent it to a professor in the United States. He's an expert in cryptology. Eventually she was able to break it. So here Hyde writes, Sir Elijah Impey told me at his house that he had accepted an appointment from Warren Hastings. And it goes on in code to talk about the details of the bribe. And Hyde is writing this in code because he's actually sitting next to his fellow judges. And we surmise that he doesn't want Impey and Chambers to know what he's writing. So I spent many months at the National Library of India reading through microfilm of these notebooks. You might think a lot of this historical research is sexy. I can tell you it isn't. It's definitely not sexy. It's a lot of going through notebooks and reading historical documents and archives. But sometimes the payoff is cool, and this is one of those really neat instances. I also spent many months at the High Court of Calcutta. This was a very interesting place to do work. They had no catalog for their archives, and I had to get permission for each individual document that I saw. So I had to make an individual application. And in the archive, I actually found an issue of Hickey's Bengal Gazette that exists nowhere else in the world. And I thought this was important for India's identity. And it was literally crumbling in front of me. And I wrote 3 different, I managed to get a photo of the document, 3 different applications to preserve it. And unfortunately, I was rejected each time. So it still sits in the archive. No one else is able to see it unless you get special permissions. So Hickey is put in jail for his writing. And him and his family remain in jail for the next 4 years, from 1781 to 1785. So the founder of India's first newspaper is actually languishing in jail, and he's still printing his newspaper. I don't have details for exactly how he did this, but I reckon that he probably devised some sort of system with help from the outside. And he continuing to defend the press with slogans like this one. The voice of the people is the voice of God, for instance. And he's also continuing to print controversial articles. This one says, we first committed a successful forgery on a native of Bengal and gloried in it. We mean the British. And it says, a native of the country who knew nothing of English laws is hanged for the same crime which we had triumphed in committing. So who is Hickey talking about? It's actually talking about Clive. So Clive, the famous man in English history, Battle of Plassey and so forth. Hickey says that Clive was made a peer in England, though he committed in Bengal the same crime for which we hung Nandu Kumar. Nandu Kumar was a Mughal and then British East India Company administrators. Basically, Hickey is saying, there's 2 sets of justice in this country. We've got a justice for upper class, the British in particular, the English elite, and we've got a set of justice for pretty much everyone else. And it doesn't take many brains to find out that this is a newspaper, despite Hickey being in jail, is still oppositional to the East India Company. And finally, in 1782, in March, after 2 years, the Supreme Court issues an order and it seizes Hickey's printing press, silencing the newspaper for good. And this is actually the very last newspaper printed on March 30th, 1782. To add a little coda to the story, Parliament in the United Kingdom recalled Hastings to England to be impeached. There were 22 charges of impeachment, everything from soliciting bribes, launching wars of aggression. And many of these abuses of power were first printed in Hickey's Bengal Gazette. And the newspaper helped furnish parliamentary investigators with some evidence. Chief Justice Elijah Impey was also called to England for impeachment. Both him and Hastings were ultimately acquitted, Hastings after many years. And after leaving jail in 1802, Hickey attempted to restart his newspaper, but it wasn't a success. And unfortunately, he died in 1802 on a ship to Guangzhou, China. And his reasons for being on the ship are unknown. So I've talked about this newspaper. I've given you sort of a general outline of some of the reasons why I think it's important. But let me offer, three more reasons for why we should care about this, and why is it really important, and why should you care about this bit of Indian newspaper history. So first reason is, many Indians followed in Hickey's footsteps. There's something to be said about someone who is a trailblazer in the work that they do. And there's one example I want to point out in particular, and that is in 1818, the first Indian-owned newspaper, this is in Calcutta, names itself the Bengal Gazette. No copies of this newspaper survive. And it was founded by a man named Ganga Kishore Bhattacharya. So it adopts the same name as Hickey's Bengal Gazette. And there's one thing I want you to note here, is this name at the very top. Paul Ferris. So Ganga Kishore Bhattacharya launches a newspaper, and he actually has advice and assistance from Paul Ferris. And Paul Ferris was a man who was actually one of Hickey's workers. He was an assistant in the printing press at Hickey's Bengal Gazette. And so you sort of have a direct family tree. I'm happy to talk about this if you have any further questions. A family tree of editors going from the very first newspaper in India all the way to the very first newspapers that were printed by Indians. And there's a pathway of expertise and knowledge that is shared. So knowledge sharing, and this eventually leads to some of the first newspapers in India. And in fact, Ganga Kishore Bhattacharya was actually worked with Ram Mohan Roy, so there's a lot of connections that are going on here. So much of the tradition and heritage of journalism in India, you could say, and I say this with a bit of a stretch, but it could stem from these early newspapers in Hickey's Bengal Gazette. All right, a second reason I think we should care, and I think it's because of how history allows us to look at our present, where we're in today, and it gives us some examples from the past that can inform how we react and how we think of things. So today we often think of social media, things like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. They're democratizing, but they're also divisive. They cause problems in society, but they also open up the amount of voices and the space for public dialogue for more people. And a newspaper in the 18th century was very similar to this. It's an idea where it's a place where ideas flourish, but so does disinformation and division. And I want you to think back to that first article I shared with you, the one by Old Nell. She's someone who would not have had her voice heard earlier. And now she has this voice, right? And she's given this opportunity to speak. And that's very unique and very interesting. And in fact, one of the unique things about this newspaper, Hickey's Bengal Gazette, is that it was often a trail runner in more than one ways. The editor had Hickey had very complex ideas about women, but he wasn't afraid to give a woman a space to speak. So it's democratizing, but it's also causing division and how it can make accusations sometimes that are not founded. And what ultimately doomed Hickey's Bengal Gazette was this ill-timed insult. And the third reason I think you should care about this newspaper is that it's important to look back to see where your freedoms of free speech and where your traditions and identity come from. And I think it's important for you as citizens to know about this and become more aware. And finally, it's just cool to learn about your own history. It shows you how people in the past lived and how your life might not be so different. So thank you again for inviting me. I really appreciate this. If you want to learn more about the story, it's all in the book. You can always ask me any questions. And that's it. I hope you enjoy the talk. Thanks. I'll end my share screen now and hand it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. It was indeed a very informative and insightful session. I won't say that it is a lecture because the session was loaded with archival pictures and videos from different parts of the country where you have actually done your research and you have actually gained the factual information about the India's first newspaper, that is the Hickey's Bengal Gazette. There are questions in the chat box. One of our student from first year, Khushi Srivastav, she wants to know what motivated you to research on Hickey's Gazette, and would you like to share your experience with us?
Yeah, and feel free to all your students and anyone out there, they can ask me anything really. I'm more than happy to answer. What motivated me to do my research? You know, it's a very complicated question because I've been asked this many times. I don't really ever have a good answer. I think I was just in the right place at the right time. And I had an interest in this history. I had worked on some projects before with newspaper history, but not in India. And in fact, I was in the British Library in 2011, 10, 11 years ago now. And I came across Hickey's Bengal Gazette for the first time. And I thought, you know, I had looked at 20, 30 different newspapers in this time period. And I was immediately struck that something was different. Something was unusual here. This was a very unique newspaper. And as a historian of journalism, and I was immediately drawn to it. And I think I was really curious to know what had been written before. It's always, you know, what if you're going to start any academic project or anything really, you always want to look at, you know, what are the sources, what's the other material, who's done this before, so you can build off of it. And I found that there really had not been any good books, any really great writing about newspaper. And I was quite surprised. And so slowly over time, the idea formed in my head, you know, if no one else is going to do this, why not me? Why not do it myself? And so that really motivated me. And I think it was quite fortunate in a sense because one of the problems in doing this type of research, and I showed you, is all the different archives around the world. And it's very difficult to get to these places often. I showed you Germany, England, India, obviously, the US, and some other places as well. And I was very fortunate, actually, because my parents live in Germany, so I was able to go to Germany very easily and visit. I had some research funding to go to London. So I was able to get to all these places and really piece together a story that no one else, I think, had the opportunity to. And that allowed me to do it. And I think that I had the original spark, the idea in my head, and then I realized, you know, I can actually do this. I can pull this off. And that kept me going. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew. Another question from Yash Joshi. Hello, sir. What types of problem faced by you to know about the older newspaper exactly? Decoding the newspaper because of digitalization or maybe the archival impossibilities. So how did you manage to get the material and how did you manage to do your research?
Yeah, at first it was really difficult. I think a lot has changed in the last, really last 5 or 6 years. When I started this project back in 2012, there was only, the British Library has a collection of Hickey's Bengal Gazette, and they had digitized that collection. But they had it behind a paywall, so it was very difficult to access. I remember begging a friend of mine who had access. I think only maybe 15 universities in the world had access to this digitized version. I begged a friend, I said, you know, can you give me your library pass? You know, can you give me access to it? And he did. But over time, there's been increased digitization of newspapers, and that's made it really helpful. There's one thing I want to mention, I think, that's unique to this case. It's that there are about 5 different collections of Hickey's Bengal Gazette, none of which are fully complete, that survive to this day. Think about this. You have a newspaper 220 years ago, and it's been some people over the past have thought this is important enough, and they've saved it. 5 different collections. Most newspapers from this time period in history, there might be one collection that survives, if you're lucky. I mentioned the Bengal Gazette founded by Ganga Kishore Bhattacharya. No copies of that survive at all. And no copies survive of other Indian newspapers from this time period. So I was really fortunate, actually, because that there was so many copies, collections that exist, really made this research easier. There's often times where I was reading articles, and you're absolutely right, Yash Joshi. There are times where it's difficult to decode what's going on because it's been degraded. The quality of the paper is no longer good, so it's really hard to read. But fortunately, I was able to compare different collections with each other, and that really helped. So it made my life a lot easier.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Another question from Khushi Srivastava. So you said research is really a tiring thing. So how you have kept yourself going on and work efficiently and motivated yourself?
I wasn't doing anything else in my life, so I might as well finish this. I can't understate the importance of having food, good food in my life. A lot of good Bengali food, which really helped in Calcutta. Yeah, honestly, just like at a certain point, the ball was rolling down the hill, and I just had to keep up with it. So yeah, I took a risk. I took a gamble when I got my book published. I actually submitted this manuscript on spec, which means that I didn't. I basically wrote the whole thing and then found publishers and agents for it, and that is a very risky way of doing it, because I could have written this whole project. I could have done it and then not had a publisher. So I definitely took a risk. I think what really kept me going was, I thought this was an important project, and I really thought it needed to be done. And so that motivated me throughout. Yeah.
So there is a question by Mohammad Ghulam Rahman.
Yeah, Manmeet,
Yes,
I must tell you, Mohammad Ghulam Rahman is a very senior journalist, educator from Bangladesh. So he has especially joined this session because when he came to know that Andy Otis is going to address this session, so he was interested in joining this session. And the question that he has put is, you can, I think, Dr. Otis, you can also read this out on your chat.
Yeah.
This is Tarapada Paul has written a book named Bharat Sangbandh Patra, described well on Hickey's Gazette. The contents of advertisement published in Hickey's Gazette seemed obscene as described there. Do you have any observation on that?
So I just quickly.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a really good one, and I appreciate you coming here. So this is the first time I'm hearing of the book, so thank you for bringing it to my attention. I just quickly Googled it, and I will definitely take a look. So thank you for that. So advertisements published in Hickey's Gazette seemed obscene as described there. Do you have any ones? Is there any one in particular you remember? Let me. I read the book long back. When I used to take class in my undergrad classes in Dhaka University. I retired in 2016 after 40 years of my teaching. So anyway, but I remember so far that in that book it is written it was for a matchmaking advertisement where it was said that the candidate should be of certain health and of not black, and a lot of other objectionable words are used there, So I just cannot remember exactly the words, but those texts the Hickey used was very, very objectionable in the society, and those words can be used as abuse of words in a way, and it was very slang.
language were there, you know.
Yeah, I don't remember that advertisement in particular. I can definitely take a look at it. I would not, I haven't seen the other advertisements in the paper. I would not be surprised. I mean, there's advertisements for slavery. There's advertisements for all sorts of different things, right?
On slavery also there. Yeah.
That's a great question. I can definitely look into it for you.
Yeah, I think you can concentrate if you can get time. It will be interesting text if you go through Hicky's Gazette.
There's another book by P.T. Nair who wrote about Hicky as well, and he spent some time in the appendix. You know, he basically copied a number of advertisements, and some of them were
another book I can refer to you. It was Indian History of Journalism from Osaka to Nehru. The name of the book is like that. It was written by Dr. Nadi Krishnamurthy. He was the professor of journalism in Mysore University long back. And he was my supervisor for my PhD initially. Long back, he died in 84, I think, yeah.
Thank you for the questions. It's really good to hear from you, and I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you, it's my pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Ghulam. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is our pleasure, and on behalf of DME Media School, I welcome and I thank you so that you have joined this BG Verghese lecture series.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Our pleasure. Another question by Vinayak Yadav. In new digital era where news have moving towards social media platform, and also what can be the upcoming challenges faced by print media in this modern era of digitalization?
I talk about this some of my current research. I'm not totally an expert on it though. Well, I can talk about the American experience, and that is there's something we're finding in the US. I don't know how much this is similar in India. Maybe you could tell me more. Is that there is more media out there than ever before, but often people's attention is focused only on the very top. So you have, say, the New York Times in the United States or the Washington Post, for instance, and those newspapers are doing quite well. But most of the other hundreds of local newspapers are really faring quite poorly in the United States. And that's a major problem, especially for, speaking truth to power, acting as a watchdog, protecting people's rights. And so we see a change with how the internet and how social media has affected these legacy newspapers, traditional newspapers. And I think that will have negative effects on democracies. And so I think a real challenge is for, especially in the United States, local newspapers being able to find a way to have sustainable business practices, a way to make money, enough money to do the essential reporting that they need to do on local government. Maybe your professors can tell me more about the situation in India, but that's certainly a major concern that we face in the United States and has been exacerbated and quickened by social media. So yeah, that's one challenge. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew. I think let's take the last question of the session. How does the freedom of press affect the print media? The question is from first year student Jyoti Mishra.
How does freedom of the press
affect the print media?
This is a good question. I mean, it's very broad, but I think you could say that, without freedom of the press, you really don't have, and by freedom of the press, I mean, there's many ways you can conceive it, but I mean, one, you have to have legal freedoms. That if you get challenged in court, that you'll be able to have, as a newspaper or as a journalist, you'll be able to have the challenge be seen quickly, fairly, and that you'll be heard and that the rule of law will continue. And then there's a second type of freedom of the press, which is the sort of mental inside a journalist head, or inside a news organization heads, and that's the not self-censoring, whether that is you have powerful interests that might support newspaper, advertisers that might not want you to write about something. For instance, And so being able to have the freedom to write and to speak truth to power is very important, whether it's from and whether it's from within oneself or whether it's from without. So these all affect the print media, and without that, you wouldn't have newspapers and you wouldn't have news channels that have a variety of viewpoints, and that really, I think, help democratic discourse. So freedom of the press is very important, and I think without it, you wouldn't have print media as you know it today, and hopefully it'll continue in the same regard in India. And that's all I'll say on that. So yeah.
Yeah, Manmeet, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Andrews, since you referred to the Calcutta High Court and as you got to some record from there, since Hicky was jailed, and as you said that he was jailed by somebody to whom he owes some money, which he has taken as a debt, and then a lot of legal actions were taken against him by the authorities of that time. So during this kind of research, whether you got to understand the legal and the judicial system which existed during that time.
Yes, much more than I had anticipated. I became probably somewhat of an expert in early British legal theories and history. Yes, yes, I did. If you want, I'm happy to go into some detail. But basically, I'm actually going to be publishing an academic paper about uses of how journalists are able to escape libel prosecutions in history. So that should be coming out this summer. And there is these notebooks that I mentioned, Hyde's notebooks. They are actually digitized online. If you Google Hyde books and then NJIT, you'll find them. And if you know any legal historians in India that want to know more about the early development of law, of an Anglo-Indian law, then we've digitized the majority of the 20,000 pages of notebooks there. It's very fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew. Thank you so much. Indeed, tremendous work by Dr. Andrew. And on behalf of DME Media School, I congratulate Dr. Andrew for coming up with such an in-depth information about the historical evidences of journalism in India. Congratulations, sir. I'm sure through this session, students and faculty members, they have benefited, and new research avenues have opened up for us so that we can go for better research in the field of print media, journalism, and also for the historical evidences related to print media in India. And of course, the scholars, they can also explore the different avenues within other continents and within other countries, just like Dr. Andrew has done. So now I request Professor Dr. Susmita Bala, Head DME Media School, to give her concluding remarks.
Thank you, Manmeet. Thank you, Dr. Andrew Otis, for giving us such an insight about James Augustus Hickey and his newspaper, Calcutta General Advertiser, popularly known as Hickey's Gazette. It was interesting to note the similarity between Hickey's Gazette and Virginia Gazette. It was also interesting to understand the political establishment of that time and Hickey's relationship with the political masters. Of course, Hickey was daring. He faced trial, but he did not yield. He claimed to be an independent journalist. He suffered a lot. He remained in jail for years, but he continued to raise his voice against unfair and unjust system. Dr. Andrew Otis has done an outstanding job by researching about Hickey and his newspaper. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Otis. We all feel obliged to you. Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Dr. Andrew, our students, they are posting messages on the chat box that they had a wonderful time during this session and they are sending their best wishes and greetings to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everything, and thank you again.
Thank you so much. On behalf of DME Media School, I extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Andrew Otis, taking out time and share his research with our students, our faculty members, and our special guest of the session. Heartfelt thanks to Dr. Rahman, who have joined us from Bangladesh. My gratitude towards the management of DME, faculty members of DME Media School, and last but not the least, the students, our dearest students of DME Media School who have joined us for this BG Verghese lecture series. Thank you, everyone. Stay connected and stay safe.
The first impression that comes to our mind about any college: tall buildings, big classrooms, large lobby areas, thick books, IT labs, assignments, class tests, and projects, nothing besides that. Every hour, minute, second spent here help us carving and shaping our persona, cultivating innovative mindsets for the challenging world. Learning is a lifelong process. Sharing knowledge, inculcating values of life, spark the innovative horizons of mind. Fun and frolic is the nature of every nook and corner here. A daily dose of thrill we are sure to get here.